Alright everybody, here we go. This week we start off with Germa successfully completing their rescue mission, and they're walking away from an explosion, which legitimizes them as legitimate cool people, except for Yonji, he kinda sucks. And so they're probably on their way to meeting up with Papa Judge. I still don't think that they were the intruders. I still think that the intruders are yet to be revealed. So I'm looking forward to that. So one of the things that I've been doing recently is that I've been stressing the visual similarities between the ending of this arc and the ending of Dressrosa. Luffy inflates his arm for a giant punch attack. He pushes through Doflamingo's resistance, and ultimately that's how he wins the fight, by pushing through the attack and just sending Dofi just flying down, which pretty much fits the mold of what happens here with Kaido. Kaido's horn gets broken off, just like Dofi's glasses break to symbolize his defeat. But now for this specifically, I'm looking at a chapter from Dressrosa, which is chapter 791. And in that chapter, we get a shot of Rebecca, and she's crying over Luffy. Her tears are falling on his face because she's so happy. The composition of that panel, like the composition of that page with her crying and Luffy's face, like just sort of being at ease, resting, is almost exactly the same as the composition of the page that we get in this chapter, except this time it's actually Tama crying. And then after that, in that chapter, we get a bunch of reaction shots, just like we get in this chapter. So I guess according to Oda, the more reaction shots, the better. I want to say that this chapter pretty clearly opens up with a slight time jump, or a leap in time from last chapter, because we see Kinemon and Kiku, and they are fully healed. And the last time we saw them was Usopp was carrying them, and they were pretty much fainted. So they got healed for this chapter, and the Scabbards are also wearing their Lunarian cloaks, or their half-moon cloaks, which were the same cloaks that they wore during Odin's procession, right? Or sort of Odin's inauguration, marching down the streets, being introduced to the citizens of Wano. So yeah, we get Kinemon doing the classic kabuki pose, and in that same page, if you scroll down all the way to the lower right-hand corner, you'll see a little panel there, and Panda Man is in the background of that panel. So the news about the Scabbards returning spreads all over Wano, and we get a shot of Ringo, where we see Onimaru. And Onimaru, I'm pretty sure, is a character that we'll get to see a little bit more in the future once Zoro wakes up. Now, as we go through these regions, something that I started thinking about is how, when Luffy punched Kaido, right, the last time, he said that he wanted to build a world where his friends could eat as much as they wanted, which gets reiterated again in this chapter because of the Tama flashback. And so all of these regions of Wano have like food names. Kibi, obviously Kibidango. Hakumai means white rice. Ringo means apple. Curry, I think, is a Japanese chestnut. And then obviously we have the udon noodles. And so the names just get me thinking about like the history of Wano. Like, who named these places? Who created Wano in the first place? Was it Joy Boy? Did Joy Boy have the exact same goal as Luffy? You know, creating a place where people could eat, and that's why he named these places after food. There's so much lore still to be discovered about Wano. And so one of the things that I think makes this chapter a good one is that it completely ignores the elephant in the room. It kind of gives us like a breath of fresh air, a break from the question of what happened to Kaido. Like, we saw a giant volcanic eruption in the last chapter, but with this chapter, Oda completely draws away the attention from that. The only moment that we get here that's connected to that is the panel with Babanuki in Udon, where we see some of the factories, some of the buildings come crashing down, and I'm guessing it's because of the eruption. But everything else in this chapter is sort of like a breath of fresh air, a break from the Kaido situation. We head inside of Onigashima, which is where all of the Straw Hats are, which I think is very cool because even though they are the heroes, they're not there in the flower capital taking the credit. It's very old school One Piece. It reminds me of Alabasta, where they save the day, but they are removed from the political ceremony. Because the truth of the matter is that they don't really care about taking the credit. You know, as long as you feed them afterwards, as long as they can have a party, they're pirates, they're good. They don't really need the credit. Now, one of the biggest points of discussion in this chapter is obviously Yamato walking up to the Straw Hats and saying, I'm going to be going with you on your journey. And so I think that's pretty Odin-like, because Odin was actually the one who invited himself into Whitebeard's crew. But at the same time, typically when it comes to the Straw Hats, that's usually not how it works. And Jinbei kind of makes a note to say, yeah, like, you have to wait for the captain. Because typically there's usually an invitation from Luffy first. If I'm not mistaken, I think only Robin was the one who kind of like started off by inviting herself first. Like, she basically said, I have nowhere to go, so you're going to have to take me in. But even then, Robin has her own moment in Enies Lobby where Luffy pretty much tells her, like, you're part of the crew. You have a place here with us waiting for you. You just have to want it. You have to say that you want it. So Robin would kind of be the exception in this case, but even then she still kind of gets an invite. Another thing that I think is interesting is Sanji and Brook's reaction to Yamato, because we get a panel where Sanji clearly hears Yamato being referred to as Kaido's son. He even repeats it. He's like, Kaido's son? But Sanji's reaction to Yamato wanting to join the crew is essentially the same reaction he would have for any other female. Now, Carrot is nowhere to be found in this, but that's not news. Oda has been ignoring and neglecting Carrot for a while now. And between the two, I always kind of favored Yamato joining more out of the two. But because this act, Act 3, which is the act where Yamato was first introduced, has been going on for so long, and a part of me, a really big part of me, just kind of wants to move on to the next thing. Like, I don't care as much anymore. If Yamato joins, that's fine. If Yamato doesn't join, that's fine. I'm good either way. Okay, so I wanted to go down memory lane again for the invites, just to make sure that I got everybody. So here is Zoro's invite, pretty straightforward. Then we get Nami's, again, pretty standard stuff. Usopp's is a little bit different because Zoro is actually the one who tells him to get on the ship with Luffy's approval because Luffy's right there. So, Luffy kind of gives it the okay as well. Then we have Sanji's invite in the Baratie. Chopper's invite is probably the most memorable. I already talked about Robin's case and how it's special. This is Frankie's invite right here. Then we get Brook's invite, which I also really like. And then finally we get Jinbei's in Fishman Island. Straw Hats didn't really get to celebrate Jinbei joining the crew, so I'm pretty sure that if Yamato does join, it'll be like an Aeneas Lobby, like a post-Aeneas Lobby thing, where they're kind of celebrating like different people coming back at once, like with Frankie being the new member, and then Usopp and Robin rejoining. Another pretty important point here is, if Yamato does join, what's going to happen to the monster trio? Because as the crew stands right now, I think the ranking is pretty obvious, right? And the ranking goes Luffy, Zoro, Sanji, and then Jinbei. And this is without Yamato. Now, if Yamato joins, based off of what we've seen, then I would have to place her around Zoro's level. Because the fact of the matter is that only Luffy, Zoro, and Yamato can use Conqueror's Haki coding. At least that's the way it is for right now. All three of them can use Advanced Conqueror's Haki with their attacks. And that's like a technique that's sort of reserved for the top tiers. Now, in a serious 1v1 between Zoro and Yamato post-Wano, I do think that Zoro ends up pushing through and coming out on top, ultimately, because that's kind of what Zoro does. The more you push him, the more he pushes back. The more he gets pushed, the nastier he gets. And so that would kind of leave us with Yamato being over Sanji. Except, I think Oda has made it very clear that the monster trio is sort of like this fixed, unmovable crew dynamic that is never going to change. Like, even with somebody like Jinbei joining, it didn't really affect the monster trio at all. So it'd be kind of like the same dynamic that happened with Odin joining Roger's crew. At the end of the day, you still had Goldie Roger, Silver's Rayleigh, and Scopper Gavin, right? So those three spots kind of remain the same. It's just that at one point, the anime did show Odin sparring with Scopper Gavin pretty evenly. But then also, despite not having Conqueror's Haki, Sanji has been able to develop this new Haki-infused flame thing. And recently, during the end of this arc, Oda has gone out of his way to hype up heat-producing attacks. You have King's final attack being sort of like a fire/lava dragon. We also got Kaido saving his fire, lava, dragon encasing thing for last, as well, as if that was like his ultimate technique. So there's something about fire, there's something about heat-producing attacks that Oda's kind of telling us, you better be careful, like don't underestimate these things. So despite not having Conqueror's Haki, there's a lot of ways in which Oda can hype up Sanji above Yamato, especially if you consider that Yamato's elemental skills or elemental strength is ice-based, and Sanji is fire-based. Now, the Tama flashback in this chapter, as well as the explanation for how her powers work and what the limitations are actually quite good. And it's a good thing we got these things. It's a good thing we got the flashback, and it's a good thing we got the explanation. The only problem, though, is the timing. This flashback and this explanation should have been given to us a lot sooner. If we had gotten this flashback earlier, I probably would have cared more about Tama as a character throughout the raid. And if we had gotten this limitation about her power explained to us earlier, then her power doesn't seem that tyrannical anymore. I mean, it's still technically temporary manipulation, but it's not as bad because it only lasts for a month and there's some freedom by the end of it. So by the end of it, they do have a say in what their behavior is going to be. And so of course we know that Tama's power is based off of the legend of Momotaro, right? The legend of Momotaro, which is about this kid, this little boy that came out of a peach, and he went to Onigashima, he went to the island of the ogres, to get a treasure back. And on his way there, he had some kibidango, and he befriended 3 animals by feeding them kibidango. So he made friends with a dog, a monkey, and a pheasant. So that's what Oda is referencing with Tama's power. So the power itself was a cultural reference, but I think the problem was that it ended up contradicting a major theme of the series, which is freedom. Now, historically throughout the series, Usopp has been sort of the stand-in for the reader in a lot of cases. He's supposed to represent like the normal human being, being part of the crew, right? So he's like the normal guy. And sometimes Oda uses him to sort of like represent the reader. That's why in Dressrosa, when he awakens observation Haki, we actually get to see it through his eyes, right? It's like we're seeing it through his eyes. That's why in episode 1000 of the anime, he actually shoots out a number 1000 to sort of break the fourth wall. And it's also why when they meet Rayleigh, he actually is the only one to ask Rayleigh about the One Piece, because that's what a normal person would ask in that situation. It's what a fan would ask. And so in this chapter, we see that it's actually Usopp, again, sort of representing the reader and asking Tama about the effects of her devil fruit. So I kind of get the impression that Oda must have heard the fan complaints about Tama's devil fruit power, and he was like, yeah, I need to address this at some point, because if I don't, it's going to be a problem, thematically. Because again, Luffy is supposed to represent freedom, and here we have this little girl that's on Luffy's side, with the power to make people obey her will. Another very important detail that I think is easy to overlook is that Tama says that her power is actually tied to the phases of the moon. The longevity of the power is tied to the moon cycle. So ever since we got introduced to the Lunarian race, ever since we found out that was a thing, I've always kind of been of the idea that it was the Lunarians who invented devil fruits in the first place. So I think it's interesting that she mentions that the moon has some degree of authority over her power, right? It reminds me of the Minks and their Sulong form, which really isn't a devil fruit power, but the Sulong form is dependent on the full moon. So Lunarians, moon devil fruits. Lunarians were from the moon, and they invented devil fruits. I'm pretty sure I read somewhere that Tama is supposed to be Oda sort of inserting his daughter into the series, which is interesting. I don't know if that's true or not, but I think it's interesting because by the end, there's a moment where she basically asks for a mother, and we know that Oda's wife actually played Nami in a stage show, or like I think it was like a play or something. Oda met her and she was playing Nami, and they fell in love and they got married. And so I think a big part of Nami's character arc is that she will eventually become a mom. Whether it's adoptive like Belmere or biological, I don't know. But I do think that she's going to end up being a mother by the end of the series. And so I think it's interesting that she's shocked at Tama's request. So I'm wondering if those panels are setting something up, because Nami did kind of play sort of a motherly role towards Tama during the raid, just like she played a motherly role to the kids back in Punk Hazard. Now, Tama's flashback also supports a point that I was alluding to last week, which is the show don't tell technique in writing. Because technically speaking, we already knew some of what had happened with Tama, right? We knew that she was weaving those hats to sell them so that she wouldn't starve. We already knew that. We were told that by Tenguyama Hitetsu at the beginning of the arc. So that's the difference between telling and showing. We were told what had happened to Tama, but we weren't shown. In this chapter, Oda shows us what Tama actually went through, and it just hits differently. We see her experience the loss of her parents, we have little baby Komainu there, we see her meeting Tenguyama Hitetsu and her learning about the Kozuki clan, which is something that she mentions in her introduction, that she believes in the return of the Kozuki clan. So not only does this flashback add more emotional depth to her character, but it also strikes an emotional chord with the reader, which I think is something that was missing when it came to Kaidou's flashback. And I know that Kaidou's flashback is probably going to be expanded on further in a future chapter at some point. But given the fact that this is the content that we have right now, I do want to stress the difference between Tama's flashback and Kaidou's flashback. So look at the difference between the emotional substance of Tama's flashback versus the emotional substance that we got from Kaidou's flashback. It's night and day. It's just completely night and day. There's so much more substance in Tama's flashback. It adds much more to her character in the present. When it came to Kaidou, we just didn't get that. And notice how the flashback doesn't even have to be that long. to be good. Tama's flashback is pretty short, but it does what a flashback should do, which is it gets you to care more about the character. The same thing happened with Yasui and Toko last week. So when it comes to the citizens of Wano, Oda has been really good about tying up loose ends and giving us some emotional payoff. Now I'm just waiting for Kaidou's emotional payoff, or like emotional resolution. And maybe if Yamato joins the crew, maybe we'll get another Yamato flashback somewhere down the line, and that's where we'll see more of Kaidou. And speaking of emotional payoff, we have Shogun Momonosuke giving a speech, and the way that the speech is being transmitted kind of reminds me of Vivi's final speech when the Straw Hats leave Alabasta. You got people bowing on either side of him as he lifts up Ame no Habakiri, which I'm a little bit sad that the sword didn't really get used for anything, at least not yet.
I mean, at least he's pointing it towards the sky, because that sword is supposed to be the sword that splits the heavens, right? That slices the heavens, so at least there's that. Now, something else I noticed is that there's a group of people bowing on either side of Momo. Specifically, a group of 9 people bowing. And so, 9 people, 9 shadows, that fulfills Toki's prophecy. Now, in this case, the 9 shadows, or the 9 characters that we see bowing on either side of Momo, are as follows. We have Kiku, we have Nekomamushi, Kawamatsu, Denjiro, Raizo, Inuarashi, Shinobu, Hiyori, and Kinemon. So that's the 9 shadows. So obviously we lost Kanjiro because he turned out to be a traitor, and then Hiyori and Shinobu, I believe, are standing in for Izo and Ashura Doji, who are not there. I'm not sure what happened to either of them. I mean, I think Izo is okay. Ashura Doji kind of exploded, but we didn't really care about him that much, just being honest. I mean, there's a panel of Chopper and Miyagi healing the wounded, so maybe he's there. Regardless, though, I do think that Shinobu and Hiyori earned their spot in that lineup, you know, in that sort of commemorative scene of the Scabbards bowing. You know, Shinobu turned Momonosuke into what he is. She protected him throughout the raid and then used her power to make him grow up physically. And then Hiyori is responsible for giving Enma to Zoro and then also luring Orochi so that he could be defeated. I mean, I still think that Hiyori could have done a little bit more, but I still say that she earned her spot in those panels. Plus, she's Momo's sister, so.
It's interesting that both Law and Beppo look kind of upset. I mean, Law is always kind of bitter, but the fact that Beppo is also frowning is kind of strange. We also get a shot of Kid being angry, and this is not the first time that Oda has drawn Kid is sort of like cringing at the celebration. It kind of gets me to think that he's getting tired of this and is getting ready to betray somebody. And then we also get a shot of Carrot, so Carrot is in the chapter. Just a corner panel there. Anyway, we see Momonosuke's silhouette sort of getting nervous, which is a pretty good reminder that despite having the body of an adult, he still has the mind of a child. So he thinks back to Luffy's words, because Luffy, being the protagonist of the series, has the power to help leaders become who they are meant to be. Momo takes a deep breath, the same way he did when Kaido had him chained up in Onigashima, and he actually restarts his speech the same way that he started his speech back in Onigashima as well, talking about the meaning of his name, which means peerless or second to none.
Well, actually, the official translation actually has Momo saying that his name means invincible. Lend me your strength and let us work toward this end together. I have traveled 20 years to save you all. From this day on, I, Kazuki Momonosuke, will lead the land of Wano. I was expecting Hiyori to pull out her mask and shamisen and just like play us out of here. Then again, I was also expecting her to jump kick Momonosuke like she did when they were kids. But no, she just makes her bug-eyed expression, which she makes when she's trying to contain her feelings. No, but we actually do get to see some musical notes at the bottom of the second to last page. And that goes bang, 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 bang. So maybe the shamisen was starting off. Knowing Oda and knowing his history of designs, I can honestly say that I never expected adult Momonosuke to look this cool. His hair kind of reminded me of Green Bull, right? Or at least the hair that we've seen on Green Bull's silhouette. No, but in all honesty, he looks like Odin a little bit, but a lot less foolish, which surprised me because Oda loves his goofy, foolish designs. But then again, this is a very serious moment, so that makes sense. And when the warrior at last sheathed his blade, the sky of the day to come danced with spinning, fluttering petals. So I'm guessing this is another reference to Ame no Habakiri, right? Sort of splitting the sky or introducing the sky of the next day. It's still not morning though. Like the sun still hasn't risen. So I'm guessing that maybe it's going to rise when Luffy wakes up. Still waiting on the dawn, still waiting on that. And you can pretty much tell how important this moment is, not just for Momonosuke, because this is the payoff of Momonosuke's character arc, of Momonosuke's journey, but it's also a monumental moment and a very important moment for the story itself. And you can tell because Oda is using the narrator box to talk about the future, which is something that he rarely does. I may be wrong, but as far as I remember, there's only 3 instances in the series where Oda uses the narrator box to talk about or to hint at future events. The first one is with the Ace versus Blackbeard fight, and he kind of says that that fight is sort of going to like cause a monumental thing or a big event, and obviously that leads to Marineford. The second moment is after Dressrosa during the formation of the Straw Hat Grand Fleet. Which, by the way, that still needs to pay off. We still have to see what happens with that. And then this would be the third time where he has Momonosuke being introduced as the Shogun, and he says, "This is the birth of the man who would later be known around the world as the great Shogun of Wano, Kazuki Momonosuke." So again, hinting about the future. Now this voice kind of gets me to think about who the narrator actually is. It has to be somebody that already knows the entire story, right? Because he's hinting at future events. I know some people speculate that maybe it's Usopp, an older version of Usopp. I know that Sabo wanted to write a book, so it could be Sabo. But now after this chapter, I'm thinking like, what if it's actually Yamato? For all intents and purposes, this was a great chapter of One Piece. And what makes it great is that this is what Oda is good at. It reminded me of Act 1, where we were barely getting introduced to this country, and we started discovering things. Oda started showing us the environment, the ambience, which is something that he's so good at creating, right? And we started noticing back in Act 1, I think, that there was something very special. There was something very different about this place. And I can only describe it as what's different about Wano is the love that Oda has for the Japanese history and the Japanese culture. Like, I think he wanted to make his home come to life in his story so that he could share it with the rest of the world. And I think he did it. Now, at the same time, this chapter being so good also highlights a problem, which is that Onigashima, at least the Onigashima part of the arc, right, was way too long for what we got. Because we spent so much time away from the mainland of Wano, from the flower capital, from the different regions, that I think I forgot what it was like, to be able to breathe in this setting, this culture. So for the majority of Act 3, we were detached from this, which to me is one of the things that makes Wano so rich. In terms of setting, there's no other arc in the series that does what Wano does. There's so many references, so many details packed into the environment of Wano. And that is just, again, it's the love that Oda has for his home country. One of my favorite movies of all time is Lost in Translation. It's a movie with Bill Murray and Scarlett Johansson. In case you don't know, the movie takes place in Tokyo, and it's the story about 2 Americans who are strangers, and they're staying in the same hotel in Tokyo, and they don't know the language, they don't really understand the culture, but they end up meeting and they have like this excellent adventure, this great experience in the city of Tokyo. In the beginning of the movie, you can kind of tell that they're both sort of depressed or showing signs of depression. But then they meet each other and they go out into the city and everything changes. And part of what makes for that change, in addition to their relationship and their connection, is the fact that the city of Tokyo is pretty much alive. To the point where I've read a couple of analysis on the movie saying that you can even consider the city to be a character because it's so alive. To the point where by the end of the movie, Scarlett Johansson has a line where she says, "Let's never come back here again because it'll never be this much fun." So that's kind of what the setting of this chapter did for me. And it reminded me of Act 1 and it reminded me of Act 2. And soon we'll get to leave. We'll get to move on. It's been a long time and I think it's time to move on, but I really will miss this sort of setting, this type of environment. I got a little bit nostalgic reading this. I'm not gonna lie. The scene kind of played out like an Oogway moment, Our time has come to leave Wano, or at least to leave it very soon. So it's been such a long time. We've been here such a long time that it feels like you're letting go of something. And my guess is that when we do leave, there'll be a giant pink dragon guarding the sky instead of a blue one threatening it. I can feel the world building chapters coming after this. They're just right around the corner. I can hear them coming, you know, the lore and the world building chapters, the ones that give us more exposition and info about the world. They're coming. They're coming very soon. So I'm pretty sure some really good chapters are on their way, and I think this was the start of those. Thank you so much for watching, guys. Take care. Yesterday, I recommended a fan-made track that I think fits this moment, this chapter perfectly, you know, to Shogun Momonosuke. Go check it out if you haven't. Take care. I'll catch you guys later. Bye.